So let's say,
for the sake of argument,
that all of the water levels around the world rise by let's say 5 feet, and it puts all the low-lying areas on the coast underwater. You think that people aren't going to just sell their homes and move?
Just one small problem. Sell their houses to who, Ben? Fucking Aquaman!
There it is, the moment that should have ended Ben Shapiro's whole career, or at the very least made him reconsider how he talks about climate change.
People who are literally, in many cases, burning animal dung for fuel?
But that's not the world we live in. Instead, we live in a world where he continues spouting equally ridiculous talking points today, apparently unbothered by the universal ridicule.
They are worried about their children dying because they cannot use fossil fuels to power light bulbs?
Why hello, my fellow apes, I hope you are well. Today, we're going to examine something truly fascinating. What happens when someone who's built their entire brand on facts and logic gets absolutely destroyed by both, learns nothing, and just keeps on going?
You probably think your opinions matter. You're wrong.
Now, I'm sure that most of you know Ben Shapiro, Harvard Law graduate, failed screenwriter, conservative master debater, and the guy who talks so fast that his fans listen at 0.5 speed.
I'm trying to teach my child how to compete and succeed within the free market, okay, folks? Gaga.
He co-founded The Daily Wire, writes books about how the left is destroying civilization, and positions himself as the intellectual heavyweight of conservative media. You know him as the facts don't care about your feelings guy.
These are facts, and facts don't care about your feelings.
Except Ben seems to have no facts and all feelings, especially when it comes to climate change. So what we're going to do is compare two clips about 5 years apart to see if being turned into the internet's favourite climate joke taught him anything, and if any of his predictions actually panned out.
China and India, they're not going to lower their emissions anytime soon.
So strap in while we dissect how climate ignorance can become a career. To begin, we need to roll back the better part of a decade to babyface Shapiro, when that hat wasn't hiding a bald spot.
So let's say, for the sake of argument, that all of the water levels around the world rise by let's say 5 feet over the next 100 years, say 10 feet by the next 100 years, and it puts all the low-lying areas on the coast underwater.
Right then, Ben constructs this entire hypothetical climate scenario. 10 feet of sea level rise.
Say 10 feet.
Low-lying coastal areas underwater.
And it puts all the low-lying areas on the coast underwater.
Then he smuggles in a massive assumption as if it were obvious common sense. He's building towards something here, and it is spectacular.
And it puts all the low-lying areas on the coast underwater, right? Which, let's say all of that happens. You think that people aren't going to just sell their homes and move?
Just love it. He deserves every mocking comment that came from this. His question presumes a functioning real estate market will exist under these catastrophic conditions, which is, of course, absurd. He's assuming the very thing that would collapse. So to be the guy that explains the joke, this is begging the question when an argument's premise assumes the truth of the conclusion instead of supporting it. Let's roll with the classic abortion is murder argument, in which the person making it has assumed the embryo or fetus has the full legal status of a person, which would make killing them unlawful.
Why do you think abortion's wrong specifically?
Well, you agree murder is wrong?
But the legal status is precisely what's in question. The argument claims full personhood to prove full personhood. Ben's doing the same structural move here. His entire just sell and move solution requires markets to operate normally, buyers to exist with purchasing power, and property to retain tradable value. But these are precisely the mechanisms that would disintegrate under the scenario he's describing of 10 feet sea level rise.
You think that people aren't going to just
sell their homes and move?
Well, duh.
Who's buying property guaranteed to flood? What bank finances that mortgage? What insurance company underwrites that risk? Ben's answer is, don't worry about it, bro. The market will handle it.
I am the most free market person on the right.
His argument also relies on a farcical minimization move. That's when someone acknowledges something serious but downplays its scale, severity, or significance. Picture one of those landlords, the sort that you complain to about your apartment flooding every time it rains, and they respond by saying it's only a bit of water, just mop it up. They're dismissive because they don't really care. Ben reduces existential climate crisis to a simple real estate transaction. Just sell and move, why don't you?
Just sell their homes and move?
Now, this erasure is strategic. It eliminates the complexity of climate displacement, the economic devastation of collapsed property markets, the destruction of infrastructure, mass refugee crisis, and regional conflicts over dwindling resources and habitable land. The question itself deploys incredulity as a substitute for analysis, implying that only fools would see complications in what he frames as obvious. To put it more directly, this free market capitalist is apparently unaware that real estate markets only function under conditions of stable land value, predictable risk, insurable properties, and functioning infrastructure, all of which vanish with 10 feet of sea level rise. But thankfully, the internet, or rather H-Bomber Guy, had the perfect response.
You think that people aren't going to just sell their homes and move?
Just one small problem. Sell their houses to who, Ben? Fucking Aquaman!
This single line captured what everyone was thinking, the absurdity of Ben's premise in a simple question. This moment very quickly became a meme, repackaged and re-edited time and time again. It still resurfaces today whenever the internet feels the need to remind itself about how ignorant Ben Shapiro truly is. Unfortunately, H-Bomber Guy wasn't there in the moment to shout this, and so Ben continues.
You think that people aren't going to just sell their homes and move? And I have more faith in human beings to deal with the crucial move from Santa Monica to the San Fernando Valley than I do in okay, we're all going to stop using our cars, burning coal, and using electricity.
This is an exemplary straw man, when someone misrepresents or oversimplifies another person's argument to make it easier to attack. Ben's performing this move precisely. No serious climate activist proposes immediate cessation of all energy use, but by pretending that they do, he manufactures an absurd position that he can easily dismiss. The strategic power this creates is immense. He never has to address the actual policy proposals that are far more moderate and technically feasible, because he substituted them with a fantasy of civilizational shutdown.
Okay, we're all going to stop using our cars, burning coal, and using electricity.
On the topic of framing, this one stumped me. Trump says Venezuelan airspace should be closed. Now, depending on the outlet, this story is framed in completely different ways. On the left, there's a tendency to immediately question the legitimacy of the operation. And on the right, the tendency is to simply state what Trump has done, with no further context. And I couldn't find a single headline that mentioned the legality of the declaration.
Don't you need to uphold the Constitution of the United States as president?
I don't know.
So, if you only read right-leaning sources, you might not realize that this move is illegal. This level of insight is only possible thanks to Ground News. They're a website and app designed to make reading the news easier and more data-driven. Every day, they pull in thousands of articles from all over the world and organize them by story, with each one including visual breakdowns of political bias, reliability, and ownership to give you a clearer sense of how the news is being framed. Returning to this story, Ground News offers more than just headline comparisons. Right away, you can see that it's being covered by over 700 outlets, with the political balance almost perfect. 31% left, 31% right. Yet the framing is completely different. They even show, bullet by bullet, how left-leaning and right-leaning outlets are presenting the event. And above each headline, you can see the same insights for every specific outlet. That is what makes Ground News essential. It doesn't just tell you what happened, it shows you the different ways that outlets try to shape your view of it. And honestly, those factuality flags alone are indispensable. Right now, you can get 40% off their Vantage plan at ground.news/rationality, or by scanning the QR code on screen. Your subscription supports this channel and helps you spot the spin. Thanks.
I don't know.
Anyhow, back to Baby Ben. Even more insidious than his straw man we already discussed is the false dichotomy lurking underneath, when someone presents two states as if they're the only possibilities when more may exist. The Daily Wire itself can provide us with examples of this when they make arguments like, you need to get married and have kids in your 20s or you'll be alone forever.
I didn't rise from my bed until 10:15.
She's promoting this lonely, terrible life.
Which assumes only marriage can prevent loneliness, or that childless marriage would also be lonely. In Ben's case here, he frames the entire climate debate as binary. Either accept total societal collapse, stop using your cars, burning fuel, or using electricity, or do nothing at all. The artificial choice eliminates the actual range of policy responses that defines serious climate strategy. What about phased transitions, investment in renewable infrastructure, adaptive urban planning, carbon capture technology? By ignoring all this, Ben appears pragmatic, dismissing every real solution as utopian fantasy.
Okay, we're all going to stop using our cars, burning coal, and using electricity. That seems to me a much worse solution than, okay, I'm going to have to sell my beachfront property at a discount price.
Notice whose perspective Ben centers here. Not the billions without property to sell, not the residents in Bangladesh facing displacement, nor the inhabitants of Pacific Island nations watching their countries literally disappear beneath the waves, but the wealthy property owner's mild inconvenience. Ben erases everyone who doesn't own sellable assets, can't afford to relocate, or lives in nations without resources for mass displacement.
Okay, I'm going to have to sell my beachfront property at a discount price.
This reveals the class assumptions underlying his entire argument. Climate change is only worth addressing if you're wealthy enough to own sellable property and relocate at will. Everyone else simply doesn't exist in this framework. The blindness here is egregious. By centering the property class's experience, he makes climate change either a manageable inconvenience for the rich or a non-issue for everyone else. With the actual crisis, billions of poor people facing uninhabitable conditions, vanishing completely from consideration. And here's what makes this even more devastating. The notion that threshold coastal properties would sell at a discount price fundamentally misunderstands how real estate markets respond to existential threats. Again, markets don't offer discounts on doomed properties. They collapse entirely, and historical precedent is unambiguous here. After Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans' lower Ninth Ward saw property values fall, not by percentage points, but to effectively zero, rendering many properties totally unsellable or too costly to do anything with. After Fukushima's nuclear disaster, properties in the exclusion zone became effectively unsellable, with severe access restrictions making normal real estate transactions impossible. No buyer, no market, no transaction. The 2008 financial crisis demonstrated how underwater mortgages trigger cascading foreclosures and systematic contagion that devastates entire regional economies. Let that sink in for a moment. What Ben describes as a mere discount is actually market death. The property doesn't sell for less, it becomes worthless, stranding owners with unsellable assets and outstanding mortgages, triggering the exact kind of financial collapse that compounds climate catastrophe with economic devastation. His whole sell at a discount solution assumes market mechanisms that would already be destroyed. And remember, this spectacular failure of logic, this cascade of false assumptions, this complete misunderstanding of both climate science and basic economics, all of this became one of the internet's most viciously mocked moments. Sell them to who, Ben? Fucking Aquaman became shorthand for conservative climate denial's intellectual bankruptcy.
Sell their houses to who, Ben?
Now, you'd think that after years of relentless mockery, Ben might have refined his approach. You'd think that the humiliation might have prompted some reflection, some evolution in his thinking. You'd be wrong.
That is absolutely wrong.
The mockery didn't teach him anything. He's immune to it. It didn't even slow him down. Let's turn to a more recent speech, one that he gave to the Young Americans Foundation, an organization that might as well be called the Wealthy Whites Foundation, in 2021, where he apparently sets the science straight.
I'm sorry that carbon-based fuels are efficient, they just are. I didn't make it that way. That's just the way things are.
This is how the clip opens, by the way. So, unfortunately, we're missing context regarding what led to this. Regardless, in this opening, Ben expresses regret while, in the same breath, removing human agency from energy policy entirely and converting political and economic choices into natural law. This sleight of hand is critical to understanding his strategy. Fossil fuel dominance isn't presented as the result of decades of policy decisions, subsidies, and infrastructure investment, but as a discovered reality, like gravity or thermodynamics. What we're seeing here is an appeal to normacy, when someone assumes that what's common or typical is automatically good or correct. To appreciate the absurdity, picture someone in the 1850s saying, "I'm sorry, slavery is economically efficient. It just is. I didn't make it that way. That's just how agriculture works." The rhetorical structure is identical. historical contingency repackaged as a mutable reality. And when Ben frames the fossil fuel economy as an unchangeable fact,
I didn't make it that way. That's just the way things are.
he immunizes it from critique. You see, if it's natural law, what's there to debate? You might as well protest the sunrise. But of course, Ben is missing the reality for the trees. The claim that carbon-based fuels just are efficient admits that the efficiency only exists when environmental costs are externalized. The International Monetary Fund calculated global fossil fuel subsidies at $7 trillion in 2022, about 7.1% of global GDP, when accounting for undercharging for environmental costs, supply costs, and foregone consumption taxes. $7 trillion. To put that incomprehensible number into perspective, $7 trillion is equivalent to double the entire annual GDP of the United Kingdom. It is over 2.5 times the amount of money that the entire world spends on its military combined. That's not market efficiency. That is massive government intervention propping up an industry by refusing to price its actual costs. Meanwhile, solar photovoltaic costs fell 88% between 2010 and 2021. Onshore wind fell 68%, and they're now cheaper than fossil fuels in most markets, even without accounting for environmental externalities. The efficiency that Ben claims as a natural fact is actually an artifact of not pricing in $7 trillion in annual costs. When you don't charge the industries for poisoning air, destabilizing the climate, and destroying ecosystems, yes, fossil fuels appear efficient.
Carbon-based fuels are efficient.
They just are.
They operate atop a century of subsidized infrastructure, refineries, pipelines, electrical grids, global supply chains, whose costs are already sunk. Renewables, by contrast, are still building that foundation and must bear high upfront capital costs that fossil fuel systems paid off generations ago. Comparing mature, fully amortized systems to emerging technologies that are still building their infrastructure is like declaring horses superior to cars in 1905, because gas stations and paved roads didn't exist yet. What appears to be efficiency is largely the inertia of historical investment rather than the inherent superiority of the technology. But all these facts are quite boring, aren't they? So let's stick with feelings. Burning coal good, wind farms bad, slavery good, tractors bad. So to strip it down, what's Ben's game? Well, it's to take human decisions and call them natural law, take political choices and call them physics, as if fossil fuel dominance just happened naturally, like erosion or tides. This is just the way things are, always have been, always will be. It's brilliant, really. Why debate what we should do when you can pretend that we have no choice at all?
I didn't make it that way. That's just the way things are. And if you're asking a family in the middle of sub-Saharan Africa not to use carbon-based emissions because you are worried about climate change in 100 years, while they are worried about literally their children dying from heat exhaustion, or they are worried about their children dying because they cannot use fossil fuels to power light bulbs.
Right, so here's the part where things get truly manipulative, and there's a lot to talk about. To start, we see Ben construct a vivid scene. Impoverished African families forced to choose between their children's survival and Western environmental concerns.
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
It's emotionally powerful. It's also completely fabricated. This is a grotesque straw man. Climate activists aren't asking families in sub-Saharan Africa to stop using energy. They're targeting wealthy nations and corporations responsible for the vast majority of emissions. But Ben can't attack that position effectively, can he? So he invents a cruel caricature. Environmentalists demanding that desperate families remain in darkness. Oh, and did you catch how Ben tried to paint climate change as a distant, abstract concern?
Because you are worried about climate change in 100 years?
This sort of minimization rhetoric has real-world impact. Sub-Saharan Africa is experiencing lethal climate impacts right now, with droughts collapsing harvests, floods displacing millions, water stress intensifying, and heat waves already killing people. But by recasting the present emergency as a future worry, Ben manufactures permission to ignore it. If the crisis is distant, why sacrifice anything today? He essentially encourages people not to change things because they're a long way off. And if you do want to do anything, guess what? You're hurting the poor. Part of the tactic here is to present only two options: fossil fuels or energy poverty. This is the same false dichotomy that he offered years before. Ben does this systematically, never mentioning distributed solar, mini-grids, or leapfrog technologies that could provide energy access without fossil fuel infrastructure.
Okay, we're all going to stop using our cars, burning coal, and using electricity.
And why? Well, because acknowledging these options would collapse his entire position, so he simply expunges them from reality. The emotional core of Ben's argument.
Well, they are worried about literally their children dying from heat exhaustion, or they are worried about their children dying because they cannot use fossil fuels to power light bulbs.
Functions as an appeal to pity, when someone tries to win an argument by evoking sympathy instead of addressing the actual issue. Think of it as poisoning the whale's piteous twin. Instead of contaminating someone's credibility with negative information, you're coating your argument in sympathy. Imagine a student who fails a math test because they didn't study, but then asks the teacher for a passing grade because their dog is sick. The dog being sick is genuinely tragic, but it's completely irrelevant to whether or not the student knows that 2 + 2 = 4. The suffering might be real, but it's weaponized to avoid accountability. Propagandists like Ben rely on fallacious appeals to pity in an attempt to make their audiences more receptive to their divisive message. Here we see him converting a policy question about emissions into a guilt test. Who could argue against saving children?
Literally their children dying.
But this framework inverts reality. He claims environmentalism demands sacrifice from the poor to protect the wealthy's future comfort. Yet, climate change doesn't work that way. The entirety of Africa produces roughly 3% of global energy emissions. Yet, according to the UN, it's home to 17 out of 20 countries most threatened by climate change. The people Ben claims to defend are already dying from the climate crisis he's downplaying. He's essentially saying, we can't worry about climate change because it might hurt vulnerable populations, while advocating for the system currently killing those vulnerable populations through climate-driven food insecurity, water scarcity, and extreme weather.
Or they are worried about their children dying because they cannot use fossil fuels to power light bulbs, right? Because there have to be energy plants. Right? That is first worldism at its best.
Ben deploys first worldism as his rhetorical choice of weapon, and, to be fair, it's a brilliant move, taking the earlier straw man and adding a layer of moral accusation. Now, climate activists aren't just cruel, they're elitists, wealthy Westerners imposing paternalistic demands on the global poor.
That is first worldism at its best.
This is a circumstantial ad hominem, when someone attacks the opponent's identity or circumstances rather than their argument. Any Brits in the audience will know this one. Anytime we question the absurdity of America's gun culture and policies, we're told, you don't even live here, mind your own business.
You're a foreigner, a redcoat, here telling us what to do.
Whatever.
Go back to where they took the guns if you don't like it.
Of course, where one lives is irrelevant to the criticism of policy, but that's the point. The move doesn't address whether the claims are true. It just delegitimizes them based on who's saying it. Ben utilizes this trick, branding climate change as first world condescension, and the genius is that he appropriates social justice language, anti-imperialism, anti-paternalism, to defend fossil fuel interests. Environmental advocacy becomes cultural imperialism, while fossil fuel dependency is recast as solidarity with the oppressed. But here's the reality. International climate frameworks like the Paris Agreement explicitly enshrine common but differentiated responsibilities, recognizing that developed nations must bear the primary burden for emission reductions and finance. The actual policy architecture that Ben's attacking already centers equity and development. He's not exposing Western hypocrisy. He's strawmanning the structure of climate governance to manufacture that hypocrisy. To round off this specific point, I really want to show how laughably simplistic Ben's thinking is. The phrase,
because there have to be energy plants,
reveals the underlying assumption that Ben wants you to accept. Energy means fossil fuels, period. But that is so obviously wrong. Returning to sub-Saharan Africa, distributed solar and mini-grids are often the least cost options for rural electrification, according to the International Energy Agency. Meanwhile, fossil fuel infrastructure requires massive capital investment, centralized grids, and fuel imports, none of which serve remote populations effectively. Ben's entire argument rests on dismissing renewable pathways for consideration, then accusing climate activists of denying energy access.
That is first worldism at its best. Right? Environment, it is a sad fact of human life that environmentalism is a first world concern. It is, because when you're trying to get by and make sure your kids don't die, this is last on your list of things that you care about.
Bolstering his feelings-based narrative, Ben frames his claim through a naturalistic fallacy, the leap in logic that assumes because something is natural or currently exists, it ought to be that way or is impossible to change. Picture someone saying, it's just human nature to be selfish. Altruism is a fantasy. The statement masquerades as an objective observation while actually advancing a specific worldview. Now, notice the pattern. Earlier, Ben tried to claim that fossil fuels were superior by natural law.
I'm sorry that carbon-based fuels are efficient, they just are.
Now, he's doing the exact same thing with human psychology. He's declaring that indifference to nature is just a sad fact of human life for the poor.
It is a sad fact of human life that environmentalism is a first world concern.
And here's the brilliance of it. This appeal to nature again erases entire populations from existence, indigenous environmental movements, climate justice efforts in the global south, communities on the front lines of fossil fuel extraction fighting for clean air and water. By defining environmentalism as exclusively Western and affluent, Ben delegitimizes non-Western environmental activism. If environmentalism is inherently first world, then people in developing nations who care about their environment don't exist or don't count. You know, it's as if every move he makes is designed to ignore the people the policies affect the most. But that's not all. Appreciate how he deepens his argument.
It is, because when you're trying to get by and make sure your kids don't die, this is last on your list of things that you care about.
That's right. He deploys suffering not to inspire action, but to justify inaction. This is the appeal to pity again, but hideously twisted. Ben claims to speak for people, making sure kids don't die, while defending the fossil fuel systems causing climate-driven child mortality. Let's put it plainly, he's using dead children as rhetorical shields for policy to create dead children. One could laugh if it wasn't so sickening. And this leads us to the ultimate irony. He's attempting to make an anti-imperialist argument using explicitly imperialist thinking. This extends the silencing we just discussed into a paternalistic appeal. Ben doesn't ask what communities facing energy poverty actually want, he doesn't cite their priorities or proposals, he simply assumes their position, using them as a justification for Western fossil fuel interests. So he argues, these poor people, they need fossil fuels. And what makes this particularly galling is that he appropriates anti-colonial language to defend a system that often operates through literal colonial-era extraction contracts and infrastructure.
This is last on your list of things that you care about. So if you really believe that you are going to cram down a carbon-free world on people who are literally, in many cases, burning animal dung for fuel, you got another thing coming.
So cram down does serious rhetorical work. The phrase characterizes climate policy as violent coercion, not persuasion. Not investment, not partnership, but assault.
That you are going to cram down a carbon-free world.
This is loaded language, when someone uses emotionally charged words to sway opinion instead of making a reasoned argument. Picture someone describing workplace safety regulations as jackboot thugs trampling freedom. The metaphor transforms reasonable policy into tyrannical oppression. Ben does exactly this, positioning fossil fuel interests as defenders of liberty against environmental authoritarianism. The line extends the straw man from earlier segments, that climate activists want to impose energy deprivation on the poor. But here, Ben adds specifically,
people who are literally, in many cases, burning animal dung for fuel.
The image is visceral, emphasizing desperate poverty, and the implicit logic is clear. If people are that poor, environmental concerns are obscene luxury. But notice what this conceals. Distributed renewables are often the solution to energy poverty, not an obstacle. Solar panels and microgrids can provide power to communities without grid access far more effectively than fossil fuel infrastructure. Ben's false dichotomy of carbon-free world versus burning dung eliminates the actual development pathways that could end such an issue. Somehow, despite international perpetual embarrassment on this topic, Ben still positions himself as the realist, the adult in the room who understands how the world actually works, while his opponents chase fantasies. Yet, as we've seen, Ben appears totally clueless about the reality of climate poverty. He simply appropriates moral authority by invoking their suffering while systematically ignoring their agency, their proposals, and their actual priorities. But let's give Ben one final chance to prove his realist credentials. Because as he continues on, addressing the Paris Climate Accords, dripping with theatrical derision, he makes a prediction, one that we can test to see how things panned out. And remember, this was all said in 2021.
People who are literally, in many cases, burning animal dung for fuel, you got another thing coming. Okay, it also happens to be a pipe dream. When people say, oh, the Paris Accords, the wonderful Paris Climate Accords. We'll get to that in a second, but suffice it to say China and India both signed on to the Paris Climate Accords. They're the world's leading carbon emitters. They're not going to lower their emissions anytime soon.
The sheer confidence here is breathtaking, isn't it? He sounds so sure that these nations are incapable of change, that they would never invest in technology that boosts their economies and saves lives. In Ben's mind, it's fossil fuel forever, and nothing will change. Except reality had other plans. In fact, it proved him wrong within a single year. India hit 40% non-fossil electricity capacity later in 2021, meeting their 2030 Paris target 9 years early, with renewable capacity more than doubling between 2014 and 2023. China became the world's largest investor in renewable energy. The world's largest. 546 billion in 2022. Nearly half of global investment, and deployed more solar capacity than the rest of the world combined. China's fossil emissions likely peaked in 2023, years ahead of the Paris commitment. Both nations have lower per capita emissions than the US. China at nearly 9 tons of CO2, India at under 2, versus America at over 14.
They're not going to lower their emissions anytime soon.
I don't know if Ben could have possibly have been more wrong. Thank goodness that he didn't label himself a prophet, huh? The Bible doesn't take kindly to the false ones.
Now, you want to know how somebody is pro-science and somebody's anti-science? Ask them a quick question on global warming. Should we get rid of natural gas and nuclear power? If their answer is yes, they are not serious about climate change.
So, there you have it. Ben never learned a thing. He remains incompetent on this subject to this day. But let's step back and really appreciate it all. 2 videos, 2 spectacular failures. Way back when, Ben couldn't understand basic economics. Markets don't function when your property's underwater, metaphorically or literally.
You think that people aren't going to just sell their homes and move?
By 2021, he still didn't understand the economics of the situation. But he was now really leaning into the emotional manipulation, using the suffering of climate victims as shields for the very system victimizing them.
While they are worried about literally their children dying from heat exhaustion.
And when he tried to play prophet about China and India, reality made him look like a fool within 12 months.
They're not going to lower their emissions anytime soon.
This is the problem with Ben Shapiro on climate change. While we're laughing at Aquaman memes and fact-checking his predictions, he's out there convincing people that caring about climate change makes you either naive or cruel. That fossil fuels will magically somehow fix everything. That the poor need fossil fuels. And that China won't change.
Wrong, 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 wrong.
But hey, at least he's consistent. We've got to give him that. Consistently wrong, yes, but consistent. The Aquaman joke should have taught him humility. It didn't. It never will. Because in the bubble that he inhabits, being spectacularly wrong isn't a bug. It's a feature. You don't need a PhD in climatology. You don't even need to be any sort of expert. As long as you're willing to stand in front of the youth and cosplay as educated, then money will flow quickly into your bank account. You don't even have to memorize it. You can uncharacteristically read it from the paper, as Ben did in this case. And unfortunately, one day, his followers will be the ones who are looking for Atlantean citizens to sell to. Anyhow, as always, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to everyone who supports the channel, including today's sponsor, Ground News. Please do check them out. They are the #1 sponsor of Rationality Rules, and their product is absolutely phenomenal. Thanks.
Can I point out that there are a lot of headlines right now about how hot it is outside? I know. It's hot outside. You know what I can do about that? 0 things. Thank God we have this thing called air conditioning. It's awesome. You know, it's a great cure for being super duper hot outside. Being a first world country. Amazing. It works out tremendously well.